The main sort of like misconception I see is that GTM engineering is just cold outbound, like done better. I really do believe that it's like less about the actual tactic and more about how you look at GTM and how you use technology to make the constraints that stop you from growing go away.
Today's episode is about go-to-market engineering with Osman, the head of GTM engineering at the company that invented it, Clay. First, we'll dive into how to do GTM engineering right, and then we walk through two tangible examples of how to nail GTM engineering with two founders live on the podcast. One with Nilo, the co-founder and CEO of Thoras AI, the AI-driven reliability and cost efficiency platform built for engineers, trusted by executives. And with Panos, the co-founder of Keragon, the automation platform for healthcare. Both companies have recently raised a larger seed round and are growing very quickly. A perfect stage to heavily lean into GTM engineering. So with that, welcome Osman, Nilo, and Panos. It's wonderful to have you on. So today's topic is a great one. How to actually turn go-to-market engineering into real outcomes. And so to set the context for our listeners, can you, Osman, quickly tell us what go-to-market engineering actually is?
Yeah, the way that I've defined go-to-market engineering is really about trying to resolve the constraints that stop you from growing as fast as possible with technology. I think that can mean a lot of different things, at different stages. The types of problems we're solving now here at Clay are very different from the types of problems we were solving 2 years ago when I started. The way that GTM will look for a a startup with 6 clients will look will be a lot different from a big company that's been around for 10 years and has a established base of customers. Really, the common thread is you're trying to solve constraints in GTM, not by hiring more people or by spending more money, but with technical solutions.
So that makes a lot of sense. Maybe to make it a bit more tangible, right? You told me when we last chatted that the list is as important as the message, or even more important. What do you mean by that?
What I mean by that is who you're targeting is almost as important, or could be even more important than what you're saying, because your message is it's really interruptive, right? It's not related to what they're doing or what initiatives they have that they are currently trying to go and tackle. If I have a list of 1,000 people who are not involved in startups, no matter how good my messaging is, if I'm selling something that is for startups, it's not going to be as effective. And so being hyper targeted, trying to identify where a prospect is on their journey and when is the right time to go and reach out is really important. To sort of make that more concrete, when you talk about at scale, you're really talking about very small percentages of response rates, 1 to 2% or higher if you're really good. As a small startup, that will not really work for you, right? Trying to stand up the systems to send tens of thousands of cold emails is quite hard for a small startup. And so by having a very specific list that is hyper targeted, you can really avoid having to spray and pray. You can really target people that you believe are in market now and who have a pain that you can actually solve.
That makes a lot of sense, and we'll dive into how to actually do it a lot more later on. You also told me, right, in order to figure out kind of the right people to target and everything, people need to shift how they think about ICP and actually move more towards a job to be done framework. What do you mean by that?
One of the problems with ICP and how it's sort of used now is it's quite static, right? We target marketing managers at early stage startups who use HubSpot. That is quite static, and it doesn't really tell you much about what they're doing. as opposed to trying to like identify specific like jobs or like initiatives that like business is currently trying to like undergo. Specifically trying to like identify like based off of what you see on the like open web and like scraping data as well as like enrichment data. What can that like data tell me about the priorities of this business? A good example here is there's like a lot of signals that you can really like hook into when it comes to cold outbound, but it's very rare that like one signal will give you like insight into what that business is doing as opposed to using like multiple signals. They just hired a like new like head of sales and they have a bunch of like job postings up for like sales reps. Plus they just adopted like Salesforce. That's much more like rich information than just they hired a VP of sales or they just like raised a new round of funding. And so you're trying to sort of take all of this like data and use it to like identify what are the top priorities and pain points of this business that we can solve.
Now, if I'm a founder, and I think you said right, there's basically two ways to kind of come up with like how I should identify those customers, or how to identify even what I should be looking for. Either you just go through a thought exercise, or you actually reverse engineer from close customers. So if I'm a founder, like how should I approach now trying to figure out moving away from, hey, marketing managers that use HubSpot to, right, companies that have just hired a certain amount of people that are using or migrating from a certain CRM and so on. Like what are the things that I should be asking myself to ideally get to a decent answer on that?
Starting off, it really does depend on how much like success you've had in acquiring customers from sort of like unrelated methods. And what I mean by that is if you have 20 customers, but they're like all people who you know, it's going to be hard to sort of like work backward off of that list because they don't have much in common. They sort of came from your own network, as opposed to trying to sort of work from a like thought exercise, I think is more realistic for like smaller startups. And what you really want to sort of try and do is like number one, don't think of constraints like in terms of where you can get this like data from or which like tools you use. When you first like start off, you really want to be in a very creative mode. Like one of the questions that like Yosh has like asked people is if you had a magic wand and you could speak to like any customer at like any point when they're like doing something or some sort of condition has become true, what would it be? And so you're really looking for if you could really put yourself and your product like in front of a business, like in front of a prospect at a very specific time, what would that time be? I think the like other question to sort of like to kind of like ask in that same vein is, you know, what kind of like pain do we solve? And what kind of like prospects would have that pain at a specific time?
Just to add to that, one question for you, Osman. Something that I think about a lot with go-to-market tooling, and as Pascal aforementioned, some of us, especially at the early stage, are newer to go-to-market engineering. So what would be really helpful is for me to understand what's a go-to-market workflow that you guys have built that makes someone think like, wow, like no human should ever have to do this process manually again.
I want to pick an example that will be like relevant to you. And so I think the workflow I would choose here is really about how we score and like segment accounts, because I think that can be like that is a flow that's really like applicable to like anyone. And so one of the problems with a lot of more traditional like enrichment vendors is they really have a standard set of fields that you get from that platform, right? You can get like number of employees, like industry, where are they based out of, how much have they raised. For Clay, there's a common set of like factors that really change how people like buy Clay and how they like use Clay. And it's really about two things. What do they sell? And then like do they like sell it? Um, One thing I would add to that as well is who they sell it to. And so those are all pieces of information that are really important for how we like target accounts, how we message them. And so one of the things we do is we use Collagent to like research and categorize like accounts on a couple different factors. So like number one is this company like B2B? Are they B2C or are they hybrid? Two is like how do they sell? Are they PLG? Are they sales led or like do they do both? And then like the like last like sort of like set of fields here is who do they sell to? Who is their ICP? And the way we sort of have this is a set of fields around what's their primary target department, what's their primary target job title. And so that is really the type of like workflow that can then be plugged into like different types of flows. And so I'll give two examples of how we sort of use that data. Like number one is just like scoring and segmentation. Because we know that we work really well with like hybrid companies, we tend to work like okay with companies that are more B2C. They tend to not have a lot of like use cases for us. And so we can score and really like weigh like those accounts higher. Two is when it comes to sort of like outbound and like targeting, we can sort of hook into what we've seen in terms of like how they sell, if they're PLG or if they're hybrid or if they're sales led to sort of like personalize how we message. And so, for example, if a company is PLG, we might sort of like reach out with a message about like enriching like free emails and trying to like identify who the person is so you can go and reach out, which is a pretty big motion for PLG. We also use the same like fields to sort of create more personalized landing pages where if you come from a specific like account on our website, you might see something about like enriching trial signups, or if you target more like enterprise type accounts, we might mention like org mapping or something like that. And so what I would highlight on that like workflow is it's really about trying to gain a deeper view into what your prospects are doing, and then sort of using that like data throughout a bunch of different types of workflows, whether it's cold outbound or scoring or just like personalizing like specific like pages on the website. Hopefully that is somewhat like applicable to you. I'm always trying to like make sure that what I give as an example isn't just something that, you know, like a high growth like startup could do. So just want to make sure that's still like relevant.
Super relevant because it sounds like obviously you guys provide the sequencing and the tools to automate manual processes. But then the most interesting part about your answer was sort of the enrichment data of helping the company understand more about their ICP and like not having to do so much manual market research, which I think is incredible.
So that's exactly right. It really all starts with that data.
While I was hearing you answer this question, Osman, it reminded me, in the in the days before LLM, in the more traditional machine learning kind of situation, we were trying to do, this feature engineering, and a lot of what you were saying, like all these extra properties or extra data that we are enriching these target. It sounds a lot like the feature engineering that we used to, and that was like an art, right? And a lot of the success and the performance of the model depended on how well you would do that. So, a question here: how much of the success of these strategies depend on actually understanding what are the extra properties that you need? And have you developed a playbook for reaching those optimum set of parameters?
One thing I'll say is we actually did like something, this must have been 2 quarters ago, where we sort of built a very simple like machine learning model. It's like nearest neighbors. And what its like job is to really like help us try to predict what the contract value of that account would be if it closed. And that's where like I really saw just like having more like features available that are more like specific to like that business are it was actually quite helpful for two reasons. Like number one, like that model, we now like have a way to really like assess of, okay, how much is this account like worth to us? Like if it closed, it's based off of like historicals. And so there are, it's not 100% like accurate compared to what it might actually close at, but it does like give us like a signal. And then two, one of the like outputs of that model is we also get back a list of the top like features that are positively changing that contract value. And so we can sort of see what are the top 25 things that change how like valuable a specific account is. But to your point, we do need to kind of like realize that there really is like never a time where you can stop and say, okay, we know like everything now. Let's like stop here and keep it going. And so I think the process is sort of constant like iteration. And here at Clay, like I think that comes from really two or three places. So like number one is what we hear from sales. They are talking to customers like all the time. And so hearing from them about, what they notice about specific prospects or specific meetings, and then trying to turn that into some sort of discrete like data point. And I'm trying to give a concrete example here. There was actually one like yesterday, which is like very, very small, but we really like learned that sort of the kind of like organizational complexity of a prospect really like impacts not only like deal cycles, but then the contract value as well. And so now like our job is how do we turn that into a discrete like data point that tells you how complex is this organization? So how many like locations do they have? How many different teams do they have? Is, one example is like businesses that tend to do a lot of like acquisitions, we tend to do really like well with because they just have a crazy stack and they're like, I need to go and simplify. And so like our job is then, okay, how do we use all of the like data that we have on the web from enrichment, from what we see in CRM to really like identify which accounts like fit that. And so what you might see is maybe in like a week, we have a new feature, which is like organizational complexity, or maybe it's like number of like acquisitions like in the last year. And then that will go back into the model. We'll do a little bit of testing, see sort of how that like changes things. But yeah, you are like very right in that this is never a thing that is like done. You can't really like put a check on it. The like market itself is like constantly changing and shifting, and so you really can never stop learning.
It's already, a huge value extracting this data and putting it all together, in a common data set, but also being able to guide people on what could be the most important parameters. I think that brings it to a whole other level.
Yes, and I think it's kind of the like start of like step two, which is like, okay, if like this is what we like know about this account, what should we do next? What's the like next like step we should take if these things are true, and they're like on a trial, we should do this and go and reach out. And so that like that kind of prioritization of like data points is like really important, because if you just have 25 data points, it doesn't mean much. You're just like, okay, I have all this data, but what do I need to do like based off of this data?
If I summarize this, if I'm a founder thinking about go-to-market engineering for the first time, the first question that I really need to get a good answer to is like, who is the right customer at the right time? And like, don't think about any data or any lists or anything else yet. It's just like, try to get as granular as possible around like who makes for the best customer that I have. Either you come up with it, or if you have enough sales transcripts and everything, you go really deep into these and try to actually like get the real signal, not what the sales reps tell you, because they're to be not as great in terms of interpreting signal. Step two is then to translate that into these like data lists of data, what I need to get out of it, or like what kind of data do I need to get access to. And that's where you can get incredibly creative in terms of what all different data sources are and how you can get that signal and everything. You talked to a little bit about like what all is possible. like what are one or two of the most kind of creative examples of how people that you've seen of how people come up with, right? They have kind of a criteria and then translate that into a data source or multiple data sources that actually give them the answer that is not, it wasn't very obvious that like to kind of get to that point.
I'll give you one example that's actually not from Clay. This is a case study we put out a few months ago that I still think is one of the most creative and most like effective like workflows I've seen. And so I don't know how familiar people here are with like Vanta, the compliance software. So one of the things they do is they have a sort of public facing like portal where prospects can see your compliance docs, right? They can see sort of, are you SOC 2 compliant? Do you have this? Do you have that? And, one of the problems with those portals is they're like often not very well designed. And Vanta, their like portal is really like easy to use. It's like on brand. One of the things that they do is they actually use AI and then screenshots of those portals to try to like analyze how like on brand is that portal with the main website. And so if you're like targeting, for example, businesses that care like a lot about their brand and have a lot of different like web properties, like screenshotting and then having some sort of like analysis of like, this is the like main website, this is the like portal, how similar are these? And so they do things like looking at the color scheme and like type and just the like overall like brand look of it. And that just like happens automatically. One like example that like I'll give that might be more like relevant for early stage. I was talking to this one founder of a startup that they help companies in Europe when they want to start to sell products here in the US and specifically like food products. And so they tend to work with like businesses that are maybe a little bit like more established, like there in Europe. Maybe they have actually like been around for a while. They're not new, but they're new to the US and they're just starting to try to get into this market. And so they were using specifically two kinds of signals. So like number one, they were looking for like businesses that had like 100 employees or more, but have just like one employee here in the US who was hired within the last like 6 months. What does that tell you? It like tells you that this is a like business that is not new. They have 100 employees or more, but they have hired their like first employee here in the US within the last like 6 months. That is like data that can really give you a lot of like insight into what that business is doing. They looked as well at like ad spending for the US from those businesses. So, how much do they like spend like in Europe? How much do they spend here in the US? When did they start to uh really like launch these campaigns for the US? And then lastly, they looked at having a new US like page on their website. And so you take like those kind of like open web signals and they really tell you a story about what that business is doing.
That's fascinating. Especially the Vanta one. I love. Now, or it's kind of the third step is then, and I know that's not necessarily in your course sweet spot, but you may have insights here as well. So first you figure out who I want to target, then you figure out like how do I best get that data or that insight. And then the third one is how do I now best tailor the message to like based on the insights that I have and based on where the company is to that company. Any kind of insights or things founders should think about as they go through this 3-step process, or like as they get to the third step in this process.
I have a couple of like thoughts here. This is definitely not the like area where I am most like knowledgeable on, but I have seen a few things here. So like one thing I'll call out for like early stage startups that are doing sort of cold outreach is you need to be very specific in your messaging. I think that's like something that like larger businesses, they can afford to have someone like reach out and just say, hey, we do like XYZ. Is it, you know, can we chat now? And they have a lot of like resourcing that means that they can sort of like boil a lot of the ocean and sort of have, they tend to have a system that can sort of take those less specific prospects and sort of more generic messaging and really turn that into like leads and pipeline. But it takes a lot of work, right? I think when you're first like starting out,
they also have the brand recognition, which helps so
the
much.
brand recognition helps a lot.
But a startup doesn't have, yeah.
When you're like just starting out, nobody really it's like really like no one knows who you are, and you're probably not cold calling because you're like a busy founder. And so being as specific as possible in terms of how you can help them really like solve a problem right now, I think is like one thing I've seen work quite well in terms of like how you message. I get cold emails from like startups like all the time, and the ones I really click on and like reply to are the ones that are like so specific that I feel like this person might like be here at my company. They just know so much, and they like point out, hey, you're like hiring for these roles. Like, are you thinking about like marketing attribution? If so, it seems like you have a whole bunch of channels that might be hard to track. We can help with that. Let's talk, and just being like super specific on why you're reaching out, what you can help with, and sort of using that to really show your credibility. And like really, it's sort of about like earning the right to like reach out. You're like reaching out to them, you're like putting something right in front of them, like in front of their day, and you want to like make sure that when they like read it, that it's so specific to you, to your business, to the problems you have. And like last thing I would say there is, I don't mean sort of the type of personalization that's like, hey, like it looks like you do X, let's talk, but really, really, really specific on what the pain is, what tools they're using, how you solve it, how that pain feels, that kind of thing.
Jokingly, right? Whenever someone sends you a great message, do you go in and look at how heavy they use clay?
I actually do. I actually do.
Nice.
I actually do, yeah. And then when I get cold calls to the like wrong number, I'll actually like pitch Clay. That's like, hey, you called the wrong person, but you should try out Clay. So little like reverse pitch there.
Nice. That's awesome. But like, I think that the core message of what you highlighted is the better you understand what is like the exact job to be done that your customer has and what is their pain point, and the better you then identify that to the data sources that allow you to get as accurate of a signal as possible, the better you can then tailor the message. And the more tailored the message is to the exact problem, the more likely, right, people are to actually respond to it, which sounds so basic on paper, and I think everyone understands that concept, but putting that into practice is incredibly difficult, right? You have to start to be very creative, and you need to have a very deep understanding of your customer and their pain of who your exact like customer is, not just the persona, but I said like the moment in time.
So like one thing I would highlight as well is you want to make sure that they feel like you actually like get their pain. And so that's where like founders, I think, have a like special advantage if they come from the sort of like background that their like startup is like operating in. If you've done like infrastructure engineering and you are a founder, the way you like talk about the like pain of like pipelines like breaking is going to be very different from like how a sales rep like talks about it, right? Being very specific of like, you see all these red lights in Sentry, and you're on vacation and you get pinged, and trying to make that pain really like visceral and show them that you really like understand the pain.
Osman, you just described my life story and background. And you're right, it does give you a phenomenal advantage. You pretty much understand a lot more about your ICP that maybe someone trying to build without that like foundational knowledge would. But I do think that there's still, to your point, a lot of sort of market research that can be, streamlined for you when you're also trying to expand, well, who else is dealing with this problem outside of maybe the infrastructure engineer? So like something that took us time to learn was, it's not just infrastructure engineers who are facing or facing the problem that we solve, but also finance leaders, of course, and product leaders as well. And so that's something that I wish we had at the very early stages, is like some signals to help us understand that instead of stumbling upon that realization, some signals to help us understand that that's the case, that product managers and SVPs of products want to be able to scale infrastructure more intelligently. One question that I have, what is like a counterintuitive, thing that you've learned about how go-to-market teams operate today versus how they claim that they operate?
I would actually say, specifically when it comes to personalization and how you do that when it comes to outbound messaging, I think, and like, let me know if this is not quite the right answer. But I think people are a little bit too bought into like fully like AI emails and like fully like sort of like like handing things off to AI as a black box or just as like a tool. Like I think even with all of the great things we have seen from LLMs, I think there's still a lot of human like reasoning and then taste that comes into how you do go to market. And the specific like examples I'd give is, like I think now this kind of promise of AI like SDRs has not like borne out all that much, especially for smaller businesses. Like I think the like idea that you can sort of plug somewhat generic tool into your stack and you just see pipeline happen, I think is not like realistic, and that's sort of been proven out. And so like my answer would be, I think it's sort of counterintuitive, but as these things become like easier to do and like more like accessible, like human taste and like human creativity becomes like more important. And so it's sort of the problem with commoditization. If like everyone can send 1,000 cold emails per day, that tactic is going to stop like working. And so, yeah, like I would say like human taste and human creativity are still like very important, if not like more important, because the like execution has become like simpler, compared to like a few years ago where you needed like, you would need like a full team of like engineers and like data analysts to kind of do these like more like advanced tactics.
My takeaway is like you hear more and more people that say cold outbound emails are dead, because right, there's so much noise in it and everything. But what I take away from listening to you, Osman, is like the bar of like breaking through the noise has just increased so much more. But if you actually put in the time, like anywhere else in life, right, you have to put in the time, the trial and error, the really think through the hard problem solving piece of like the creativity of the data sources and then tailor the messages to it and everything. If you do that right, though, you can now write so much better cold outbound emails that are so much more personal than ever before. Again, right, storytelling matters and so on.
Exactly. And just to sort of make that a little bit more concrete, what I meant by that kind of like first part is, from what I've seen, having copy that's sort of a like hybrid between LLM created copy and then like a human like written like skeleton tends to be way like more effective than just like something that's like entirely written with LLMs. And so, as a specific like example, one of the cold emails I've seen do quite well is like it's quite simple. So it's templated like sort of email, but there's 2 or 3 specific like parts that get filled in with LLMs. And so one of the parts is we go on their website and research, and we like find a like logo or a specific quote, and then we like find a like business that looks like that customer. And so then we say, it looks like you work with like this customer. We can help you get more customers, for example, X. And so if you have a like a, I don't know, a like logo for like Salesforce on your website, we can say we can help you close HubSpot. You already have Salesforce as a customer. We can help you get like more customers like Salesforce, for example, HubSpot, and just sort of trying to use like LLMs for the parts that they're really like effective for, but still having that kind of like human like skeleton like email, if that makes sense.
The amount of emails that I get as a venture firm from people like offering to give us introductions to startups, and then you look at the examples that they give and they're all like Series A and Series B startups, even though we only lead the first round, is like infinite. And so like just do your research, right? And which is now possible, and send me companies that haven't raised yet, then I may actually pay attention to you.
I completely resonated with what we said before, that especially for email as a communication channel, the bar is so high right now. I usually say to all my colleagues that my inbox is a black hole at this moment. So it's by chance if I catch an email. But yes, occasionally the rare email will actually go through. So yeah, the bar is really high. But I have a quick question around other AI modalities, because especially in healthcare, I see a lot of uptake in voice AI agents, and I think that's a new technology that I don't know how many people are using right now in go-to-market strategies like the ones we're discussing. But yeah, I'd be super interested to see if you see adoption in technologies like this, or if you think this is gonna be something that's gonna become popular over time.
I kind of like split these into two types of like use cases. Like one is you actually have like AI speaking to a like user or to a prospect. So like maybe I get a cold call and it's from like AI. On that sort of like workflow, I would have to say I'm somewhat like skeptical right now. I think the kind of approach or the sort of like philosophy that like I've had is to use like AI for like things that humans are not like advantaged to do, and have humans do the things that humans do best. And to me, I think cold calls and sort of that kind of like idea of a human to human conversation, it's like something that is somewhat hard for me to see being like effective, like at least in the next couple of months. I think the like other use case is sort of like AI like voice, but more for like internal use cases, or maybe not quite trying to like simulate that human to human conversation. And I specifically, the type of use case we've sort of spent the like most time on is less so about like AI like voice, but more so about using like AI to try to like extract pieces of like insight from conversations. So for example, we have a workflow that like runs and tries to like identify calls where someone has mentioned a specific competitor or a specific like vendor. We also see if they like mention some sort of date for their renewal, and if they do, that gets like pulled into Salesforce. And so for like us here at Clay, I would say we've mostly like done that sort of like AI like voice type of workflow where we're using like AI for like extraction. And then one thing we've tried as well on the like education part of the house is using a product called like Yarn to sort of create these AI like videos that use like a template. So for example, you can record some kind of like tour video like once, and then have like different people's voices and video like show. And so you can kind of take like one video and turn it into like 20 videos with a different like sales rep like on each one.
That's cool. So I think because I want to make sure we move on to then like making all of this very tangible. But I think the three main takeaways that I have is one, right? It's incredible what you can do, but it's a lot of work to actually do it right, and to do like you can't just wing it. And and try to think you're going to get great results if you don't really spend the time and the brain capacity doing it. The second thing for me, and that is kind of related, is it does just take quite a bit of time, like to figure this all out. So you can't just do it in you can basically say, hey, I'm going to try GTM engineering and see results in a month. Like you have to commit a couple of months of really hard work in order to do it well to see a result. And then the third thing is you're really only limited by your creativity, because there's so much data out there and so many things to automate and so many messages to get right. And so the more creative you can get here and the more things you can bring in to make you feel human and personal and everything else, the better you're going to do.
Yeah. And just the last thing I would say is you really want to like earn the right to like message someone. And so the question I would ask is sort of, did you earn that right? If you send something that is like low effort and very generic, you clearly did not, versus if you like send something that is like hyper targeted, very personalized to the pain that they have, you've like earned that right. It's not something that is just like spray and pray, but you're like being very like intentional about who you target and what you say.
So now to make this more personal, that's why I asked Panos and Nilo to be on the call. I want to actually go through a real example with them. And so Osman, go through, ask them the questions that you need to ask in order to kind of get the data points that you need to then kind of walk us through how you think about a GTM engineering for them. But maybe Panos, just before he asks you those questions, so people remember, because I said in the intro, mind just quickly saying in a sentence or two what Keragon does, and then we can jump in from there.
A really quick overview about what we do. Keragon is an AI automation platform built specifically for the healthcare ecosystem. So if you're familiar with tools like Zapier or N8N, we are the HIPAA-compliant version designed specifically for healthcare. We let practices automate workflows across their systems in a way that's fast, secure, and reliable. So instead of doing manual work, copy and paste between systems, Keragon automates all of that and makes them run automatically.
Awesome. Over to you, Osman. I'll let you ask him the questions that you need to ask to help him figure out his go-to-market engineering.
If you had a magic wand and you could speak to like any like health clinic, like hospital at a time when something has become true, or they're currently like focused on some sort of like initiative, what would it be?
For Keragon specifically, this magic moment would be, for example, when a healthcare organization has adopted a new EHR. So EHR stands for electronic health record, and usually it's the central system that organizes all the healthcare operations for that organization. Examples are Epic, Athena, eClinical Works, Healthy, and the list goes on and on. And I think the reason why I would choose that exact moment is because at that specific point, these organizations usually have spent months and months and a ton of money to roll out a system that, in theory, should modernize them. But what they suddenly find out and discover is that this migration has broken all their workflows. So, for example, intake doesn't flow into billing anymore. Scheduling systems are not synced between them. Referral loops get messy. Data is siloed between systems. And then admin staff, healthcare operators start moving data between systems manually. They use a lot of copy paste. This is a very error prone process. And all of this, when it happens day in, day out, it sucks a lot of operational drag and eventually leads to burnout. So, ideally, if I could talk to an operation person within that organization, like a COO or a head of operations, in that first like 30 to 90-day window after they roll out such a system, that would be the magic moment for me.
That is awesome. I like love what you guys do. I think when I hear of a startup that is like bringing the sort of like automation like tools that we like in GTM are very like used to more traditional sectors, I just like love to hear that. So that is a very, very good and very specific sort of like initiative, right? They just like launched this new system. It's not when they're trying to like scope and like figure out what to buy. It's when it's been launched and now they're kind of like in that like first like period where this thing will like go from, we think this can solve the problems we have to, oh man, there's a lot of things that like are not missing. We have this big system in place. We need to scramble. And so I want to kind of like take us through this like thought exercise. And so the first like follow-up question I would ask you is, when a hospital or like a like health clinic or a like health system has like rolled out a new EHR system, what kind of things do they do? Are they putting out like some sort of like announcements to their like patients? Are they and like the way I would like think about this is like kind of like twofold of like, what do they do that we can see like publicly, like on their website, that we can see on social, that we can see sort of across the web? And then two is, what do we see when it comes to their web properties? Do they have a new script? Do they like suddenly have a new like subdomain? But can you sort of tell me a little bit about what that looks like?
I think it's important here to say that when we talk about healthcare organizations, there are, these could range from small, like single physician practices to huge health systems. So when we're talking about health systems adopting a new tool, that's big news. So you can probably find out about this, from PR, from news. There are specific sites that follow this kind of information as well, because for example, like a huge organization like, a Mayo Clinic, a Cleveland Clinic, like adopting a new EHR. It's a multi-year, multi-billion-dollar project. So this is kind of a thing that makes the news, right? So for that kind of organizations, I would say that's definitely one of the areas that I would look to to get, data points to understand that this thing is happening. For smaller, which is also true about the larger ones as well, but for small to medium, things like portals. So a lot of these EHRs have portals that they make available to patients so that they can request their medical records. They have there was a lot of legal struggle between the government and the EHRs about data transparency and the right for patients to be able to request their medical records. So these companies now have to offer a standard API, which is called a Fire API. And by, for example, a simple heuristic would be, okay, let's see how the URL for that API is. It fire.epic? Is it fire.cerner? So a small heuristic that you can use to understand what they use by looking at these portals. But also, for smaller systems, I really liked your example that you talked earlier about, getting an SMS that's you understand that Nexthealth is behind that specific practice. So that's another way. I think there is a lot of data points if you think about it in a systematic way out in the wild that you can understand and search for them.
This is actually a very like information rich thing when people do, when like hospitals or like smaller clinics do this, where you actually have a bunch of different ways you can get like signal on this. I want to make sure I don't go into the specifics too soon, but just sort of like thinking through what we just like talked about. It seems like number one, there's a specific compliance requirement to have this kind of like link on your website for people to go and like access their like health records. Two is, depending on the size of the like hospital system, this is actually the kind of thing that may like show up on specific like industry news websites or like on their own like blog posts. They may put out a PR statement about, hey, we just launched this new system. We hope it'll do like X, Y, and Z. And then lastly, it's sort of looking at the kind of like makeup of their like site. Sort of what do they like link back to? What do they scrape? Or what do they show on their website? And so I think actually this is actually one of the more straightforward type of GTM like engineering like flow. Let me know if it's too soon to get too specific, but I have kind of like two thoughts like in mind here. So like I think you would sort of have two workflows. One like workflow is, it like really starts not with a specific like hospital system or a specific clinic. That like workflow will start with a like search. It'll start with some kind of search that will like happen like on a schedule. And so, for example, a lot of PR like sites will actually have RSS feeds. That's something you can hook into and start to kind of like ingest and like pull in. And then, like at this point, you actually don't even need like AI. It could just be pull in, new press releases from this website on a schedule and have a very simple sort of check of, does this contain the words like EHR or like electronic health record? And then like at that point, you can kind of start to do more like post processing, like, for one, okay, now that we know this PR statement is kind of like about this new system, how do we know which hospital, like which clinic, which system? And that's like, I think where LLMs can be really like valuable. It's the kind of task that is actually very trivial for models to take a look at a press release and like kind of come back out with who it's about, like which hospital system. Two is, there would like also be, I think, some sort of like source where you're pulling in a Google search like on a schedule. This is a sort of very tactical thing that like I like, is using like searches, because like number one, you can be really, really specific. You can like set up a couple of like Google searches that are like limited to like, let's say, the last 2 weeks, and you're looking for keywords like new EHR, like just launched new systems, or like EHR implementation. And then those kind of go into the exact same flow where you have these kind of like searches that are like running on a schedule, and then like a model that is sort of processing these and trying to extract who specifically is this about, which hospital, which system. And that's kind of the first like check on step one. You could like also actually go a little bit further and kind of like identify what did they use before, to kind of have that as like another like data point that you can use to go and personalize. And that's also like something that, could be like mentioned in that PR release, could be something where you have AI go out and do really kind of like research, like based off of that PR statement. And then I think the like other like flow is more so when you have a specific like hospital or like health system in mind, and you want to know, what do they use? Did they migrate to the system like recently? And so like that's kind of like the way I like think about the two parts of this. There's like one flow where you're constantly like searching for who now is like meeting these conditions. And then the like flip side of that is, when you have a specific like business in mind, how do you like plug that in and get back those kind of details that you need. Does that make sense? I hope
It makes a lot of sense, and I think they're all of them are to the point. And what I really like about these workflows is that I think they're generalizable, right? Because I've talked about the scenario where the organization will switch EHRs, right? Because as I said, that's a huge change. It's going to create the most amount of change in the organization, and as a result, I think it's going to create the biggest amount of need, right, for a tool like Keragon to come into the equation. But there are situations where it's not the EHR that changes, but let's say the organization will adopt a new tool. It's not the HR, but maybe it's a new billing platform or a new, they adopt a new revenue cycle management platform. Again, these workflows that you just suggested, I think they could very well be generalized and to identify that, okay, this organization is adding this new tool in their stack. And then the messaging becomes very obvious. Do you need help connecting X to Z, where X is the new system and Z, is the EHR? So I really like that, these workflows can even be generalized for situations like this.
Two quick things is like, you're actually very like lucky that your prospects have a lot of compliance requirements, because it means that they like put out a lot of data. And for example, one sort of like tactic to try and like identify what tools do they use is to go and like look at their list of subprocessors. That's something that if you are in a like sector that's very heavy on privacy, you can't just like get a new tool and start to use it. You need to sort of go through a like process, and it will usually like kind of like show up there.
100%. Again, connecting to the example you said earlier, Vanta, right? So we are under compliance. We use Vanta actually. We have the trust center deployed. So right there, you can see all of the sub processors. So just by scraping that, you can understand exactly what the stack is all about. It's the same with other healthcare organizations. It is a compilatory requirement to list the sub-processor. So if you have a way to crawl and scrape that systematically, then you know when there's a change in the stack, you know when tools come, when tools go. So yeah, another way to understand what we're talking about.
One thing I would just like highlight is this doesn't really like end when you have that kind of specific signal that they have like just like adopted a new system. You can actually go a little bit like further and try to profile that like hospital system or that clinic to try to like understand a few things. So for example, you know that if this is a sort of like one person shop, the type of like messaging that you want to go out with will be quite different. If you pull some sort of like enrichment to see, do they have like job postings for EHR like integrations? Maybe that's something you could hook into. Like they just launched and they're hiring. That's a big sign that they have a problem. You could, look at things like, did they hire a new VP or a new like CIO recently? And that's like, okay, there's like a new like CIO, they just adopted this new system. Like that's a whole different kind of messaging as opposed to if they just had a team that has been there for a while. Like maybe you try to pull, how many people do they have that would like work on this project? If it's a huge like hospital system, but they have like 4 people on this project, maybe you can like assume that they're like stretched, and that's the kind of like messaging that you would go out with is, do you have a tool that can help like small teams really like reclaim time and stop like fighting fires and just like automate things in a way that's like really efficient?
This is fascinating. And thank you, Panos, for all the questions. I want to make sure we get to Nilo as well. As a second example, Nilo, do you mind just very quickly telling everyone what Thoras does, and then I'll hand it over to Osman again so I can actually ask you the questions.
Companies that use Thoras have come to the realization that managing cloud infrastructure no longer scales when you try to do it manually. So Osman, one thing you mentioned before, which was super relevant, engineering teams, they're stuck firefighting, dealing with unpredictable traffic, overspending on cloud resources as a result of worrying about the former, and suffering reliability issues in the process, right? And obviously, as a former reliability engineer, the integrity of how my software runs and making sure that it's available to my business's customers is always going to be the most important thing as an engineer. Um, but again, the way that we traditionally do this is overspending on these cloud resources. So that's exactly where Thoras comes in. We replace the very reactive model of scaling infrastructure with autonomous AI that continuously optimizes infrastructure in real time. And we do this while keeping services reliable. A business that onboards Thoras can save anywhere between 30 to 70% on their cloud bill, while also giving their engineering some time back that's usually spent on manually fine-tuning these capacity policies. So Thoras essentially makes infrastructure self manageable.
Very cool. Same question to you. If you had a magic wand and you could speak to any business when some sort of condition has become true, or they're in the midst of a specific initiative, what would it be?
So I've been in certain situations like this, but obviously the more data, especially at certain companies right now in our current environment, would be incredible. I personally would love to sort of be a fly in the wall when, a customer has experienced some sort of, marching orders from up the chain that they need to cut costs by a specific percentage. And within that moment, I would love to hear what their knee-jerk reaction is. Is it to, especially when it comes to cloud compute, which is usually one of the largest costs of any business. That IT spend, most of it's always going to be, the cloud provider bill. So understanding what is the knee-jerk reaction? Is it to try to look internally? What can be done? Do they look externally for help? And then also, even before that, what are some of the triggers that lead to those marching orders of we need to cut costs? Because that's not always an indication that a company is not doing well. Sometimes it's an indication that the company's doing really well and they need to go push more product, right? But to do that, they need to be more responsible. So yeah, understanding what happens through a customer's mind during those moments would be valuable.
I love that. And just to sort of play that back, what I'm hearing, and I do like how you said just because they're trying to cut cost doesn't mean that things are not going well. I think if you didn't have that in mind, maybe you would try to target startups that just had a layoff and things would not go so well because they have no money. So from what I'm hearing is this is really about when finance starts to take a look at cloud spending, cloud budgets, and you sort of start to have that first collaboration between finance and SRE or infrastructure, and there's this kind of cross functional collaboration. The other thing I heard is that for you it does matter sort of how early of a read you can get on that being the case or the condition. And so number one, I like how this is it's not as sort of straightforward or not as obvious as what we kind of went through before, but I think there's actually quite a lot of signals that you can use. I think for you, the challenge will be twofold. It's number one, you will need to use a variety of signals to kind of try to get to this point. And then two, I think for you specifically, the sort of profiling component will be quite important in terms of how you message or how you know if there's a pain there. And so I'm going to try and make this as like structured as possible. But I think like number one, if we can kind of like brainstorm together, what does it look like from the perspective of that business when these things are happening? So like maybe the startup is growing quite fast. They don't really have like a finance team, and they've started to put out like job postings for like finance jobs that mention specific cloud technologies. But I kind of want to just do a bit of like back and forth and kind of like think through together. What does that look like from the perspective of that like business? Who are they hiring? What kind of tools are they adopting? What does their growth look like?
The reason why the triggers are so important is because, to your point, we don't want to, and we don't target the company that's, they're not doing so well, or they've kind of become a zombie and they need to cut costs. So understanding the trigger that leads to a positive signal as to why they want to cut costs, that's how we know that they're in sort of our market. And one of the ways that we naturally can defend against that is, we attract customers who their number one utmost priority is, I want to make sure that my system is as available as possible, right? Like I have SLAs. Every, minute of downtime that, breaches that contract will cost me money. I have so many customers. So, and that's why for so many years, this was just done manually because of that fear, right? And so our competitive moat is truly being reliability first and emphasizing, we want to make sure that we're using intelligent business metrics to truly understand what your capacity needs are. And then the cost savings piece is the added benefit of scaling more intelligently. So some of the triggers you mentioned, a few that we look at, usually the companies that we work with, they're high growth and they're mature enough where they already have a finance team. But again, scaling manually has become out of control to where it's not just like developers that can handle it. They need to now go hire reliability engineers like myself, right, to go and help to scale infrastructure. So that's usually a good signal. And of course, at some point, every, large high growth company, at some point, the finance team, VP of Finance, CFO is going to take a look at that pretty rapidly growing line item on cloud. And they're going to say, well, okay, my revenue, let's say my revenue is growing, 100x every year, but so is my cloud bill. Like, how can we also make sure that, we're not growing revenue at the same pace that we're growing our cloud bill? And so, a lot of times companies will look at that more carefully when they're getting ready for, again, big events. So things like acquisitions or going IPO. And so again, we look for a lot of triggers where, there's those inflection points at the company.
Awesome. So like, I know we just have a few like minutes here. And so I want to make sure I can kind of talk about some of the more unique tactics. It seems like you've actually done like a lot like already of like looking at, who are they hiring? What kind of like job postings do they have up? And so I kind of want to try and like focus on some of the more creative or more unique signals. The first place where my like mind goes is kind of looking at like status pages and seeing sort of how, does this like business have some sort of problem with reliability? And like, I think that would sort of slot more into profiling as opposed to a specific type of signal that's like, it's not quite like if you see that they tend to have a lot of like bugs and things like that, that you would reach out, because your product, it's more about the cost part of it, but the sort of like downtime component is more of a sign that they have a problem on the like infrastructure part of the house. Like, I think the other really interesting thing you said is there's sort of a couple of like inflection points where this becomes really top of mind, when a company is going public, or when they're doing some sort of like acquisition, or they're like raising funding, or they have like just raised funding. And so I think that is kind of where my head is like at right now, is like, how do we sort of capture those like inflection points with the sort of profiling that you need to kind of like spot a specific type of pain? And so I think there's actually a couple of like smaller signals that you could like roll up into this kind of like story of like, are they preparing for one of these like inflection points? And to me, it's sort of partly like hiring, like you mentioned, which I don't want to go too deep into because it seems like that's like something you have a good handle on. Um, but I think the other potential place you could look at is really at what is changing when it comes to their privacy policy, their terms of service. I think one thing that you mentioned is having some sort of like SLA or like downtime guarantee is like a sign that they're like starting to take these things more like seriously. I think the other thing I would look at is sort of what tooling are they using and what tooling are they like adopting. So using things like, for example, like Datadog would be a good sign that they care about like infrastructure. Um, yeah, I think yours is like definitely the kind of challenge that would require a lot of data put together to tell a story. But I kind of want to, before we jump off, I kind of want to think through like what would be the top or the most creative or unique signal for you to go off of. One question I would pose is sort of like, how early is too early?
We definitely don't want to work with companies that are too early because typically they tend to be in build mode, and there might not be enough traffic to justify paying attention to scaling infrastructure. So again, companies have to reach certain milestones in revenue and in cloud spend to be qualified. But some of the signals that you mentioned are unique. Like one thing that I'm looking for, one of our strong suits is how fast we iterate. It is why, we win deals all the time over large enterprises because of the fact that we treat go-to-market engineering like product engineering. They're so married to each other, right? The engineering team isn't just supporting customers. They're supporting like a growth engine. So every deployment, every customer becomes that feedback loop that, it improves product, it sharpens models, and then it goes back to help us accelerate adoption and market research and all of that. So I'm always looking for ways to further make that our strength.
Yeah, I think actually where like my head kind of like jumps to right now is like I think it would actually be a good like signal to look at like high growth like startups that are that have like launched a like second product. I think that might actually be a really good like reflection point because that is kind of the point where things start to like break and and your stack starts to not quite fit what you need now because when you look at most like startups, they're kind of like initial product. It's not going to be the most like elegant or the most resilient thing. They're trying to build as fast as possible to get to PMF. And so I think that sort of like second product of like now we're like doing something new. We're like moving from being a like one product sort of like business to having like multiple could be a really strong signal. And I think you would want to sort of like marry that with some of the profiling. So for example, if they just launched like a new product, but they have really bad like uptime, that's, I don't know why they did that, but that's kind of one kind of messaging you could sort of like go out with. And, like I know we are close to being at time here, but that's kind of the last thing I would highlight is once you have that sort of that kind of signal, it really does not stop there. It's kind of like once you have that, it's about what other pieces of like data do you need that would change what that like signal actually means to you. If they are like launching a like new product and they have one person on infrastructure, that means like something quite like different from if they're launching a new product and they have like a full team of like 10. And so, um, I think that sort of combination of like timing with those signals, but then also profiling to get as close as possible to what their like pain is and how it kind of looks like inside the business when they're like handling this problem.
That makes a lot of sense. It's a super novel suggestion. I think we do that subconsciously, but we've never actually maybe automated that piece. And it makes sense, right? Like you build and spend and move so quickly with your first product, you reach, max success, and then every big company wants to go and stay competitive and push out new products. But you don't necessarily want to build in that same borderline irresponsible way. Like you want to be more intentional about how you build it and safeguard your investment in this new product offering. So yeah, like I said, I think we do that subconsciously, but I think making that a very strong and definitive signal is a great idea.
And just so it's more concrete, like I think the way you would actually like do this is likely with the same sort of like setup where you have some kind of like search that is kind of like on a schedule and like pulling in, those results and then processing them. And so like maybe the kind of like search is like product release or like new feature, things like that.
That's awesome.
This was fascinating, and thank you all for entertaining that. I want to ask each one of you just a very quick wrap-up question. Just give me like 1 or 2 sentences on what your take is there. Maybe Nilo, since you just went through the exercise, what was the most kind of insightful piece or new learning for you from today's discussion?
When I asked him about what's something that like no one should ever have to do manually again, something that I didn't even know that you could completely sort of holistically automate, which is, obviously everyone has some sort of like sequencing offering in this space. But, tying in real enriched data into that, I think is just such an obvious and incredible value proposition. It's something that I'll admit that we do a lot of times, obviously through AI, but outside of like our go-to-market stack, and then try to plug that in. So yeah, anything that allows you to have that intelligence, available and ready so that you can just build sequencing around that. I think that's an incredible value proposition.
Very, very well said. Having intelligence like ready so you can like build around it. I think that's exactly it.
Panos, same question for you. What was kind of the biggest aha moment for you during today's discussion?
For me, a certain aha moment was, we're an automations company. We think about automations every day, all the day. But usually how we think about automations is, we automate things about using specific properties or specific data points. And usually a lot of the times we think about these properties or this data, individually. I think one of the big takeaways here is that when you combine everything together and you create a story, and that brings it to a whole new level. So building these automations, not just based on individual data points, but on a story, which was constructed using all these data points, really, really, really takes this to a new level.
And then Osman, just for you, right, because you work with founders and everyone on GTM engineering a lot, what is kind of the one thing that too many people get wrong about GTM engineering, or that they misunderstood and that you almost wish they understood better, kind of going into this?
The main sort of like misconception I see is that GTM engineering is just cold outbound, like done better. I think, the reason why I sort of chose that very specific like way to define it at the start is I really do believe that it's like less about the actual like tactic and more about how you look at GTM and how you use technology to make the constraints that stop you from growing go away. I think those constraints will change as your like business grows and changes. There's GTM engineering like use cases like on marketing, on CX, on support. There's a lot of like use cases beyond just the sort of well-known cold outbound type of approach. And so like I think for me, that's the biggest like misconception that I would want to sort of go away.
It's almost like, how do you make better decisions and understand your customers a lot better across anything that touches your customers? How do you use data to make a lot better decisions and be more almost like proactive versus reactive towards anything customer facing is maybe a good summary of what you just said.
Very well said.
Amazing. This is a great place to wrap. Thank you all so much for coming on, entertaining all
Thank you,
this.
everyone.
Nilo and Panos as well for going through this exercise with me. This was fantastic.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having us.